Intellidex has published a report entitled Investment Research in the Era of Fake News. It's a damning report about short seller Viceroy, which made disclosures about Steinhoff late last year, and it's been unrelenting in its allegations against Capitec about its lending practices. Well, to unpack the report and the broader issues, I'm joined in studio by my colleague Arabile Gumede, who attended the Intellidex media briefing. Thanks very much for joining us, Arabile.
Sure thing.
So, what was the thrust of what Intellidex was having to say about Viceroy?
Well, pretty much in plain and simple terms, you plagiarized the report you put out that essentially made you prominent in South Africa's market, and you used that influence as well that you had gained to then make a greater influence on the likes of Capitec, where you saw the price fall around 25% after calling them essentially a loan shark, which hurt and dented that company as well. So essentially, it was a report that the business leadership of South Africa had said that they wanted to commission and paid for it in full, saying that all the members of BLSA had essentially paid for it, and it isn't just paid for instance, just by Capitec in itself, and said ultimately that the report findings, which were led out by Stuart Theobald, who is of Intellidex, he then set out and said, well, essentially, we find that they've plagiarized here, and they've used almost exact words from a similar report which came out from a company called Pro-C Asset Management around 6 months earlier. So it's quite interesting to see how that dynamic continues to play out, because now it seems as though Viceroy may even be bogus in the way it does research.
So, as I mentioned in the intro, Viceroy has been really unrelenting in its allegations against Capitec, and Capitec has come back each time, just knocking each of their allegations one by one.
Yeah.
What did Intellidex have to say about that particular issue?
Well, they didn't lay into that precisely, because they used this to really speak a lot more about what happened with Steinhoff. But let's remember that part of that issue, even with the Capitec one, is just the fact that because they're a short seller, some of the reports and the data they put out, which is, I must add, from anonymous sources, is one that one has to question continuously. So they have said as well that despite Capitec putting out, those damning retorts after Viceroy puts out, its damning information, they certainly feel that they will continue to hurt another company and continue to do so based on stuff that they actually don't understand. They're also saying that Viceroy in itself is just trying to hurt the market in order to gain that market share. So because they're short sellers, if that price falls, they're able to buy it cheap and they sold at a higher level, right? So the profit is made on their part and certainly would help them as well. At the same time, they're not actually a registered entity. And that becomes a worry as well.
Indeed, it does. So now, at the beginning of any given research, you have a hypothesis, which is basically you make certain conclusions in your mind, and your research seeks to almost confirm your hypothesis.
Yeah.
So it seems as though the hypothesis was simply to discredit Viceroy. I understand that there were things in the report that spoke to certain members of the Viceroy team about things that they've done in the past that speak to their credibility or lack thereof. Yeah,
one would definitely say that in the bulk of this report, they're really tackling the man as opposed to the ball, right? They do detail exactly how inexperienced the members of Viceroy are, how they're plus minus around 24 years old, and are ill-prepared to be doing the work that they're doing. The research that they're getting is from other people that they don't know who they are. And although, Viceroy did come back and say, well, we do backtest our information and our data, despite it coming from anonymous sources, for at least 3 months before we let it all out. And yes, certainly the report itself by Intellidex looks as though it attacks completely the integrity of the members of Viceroy. And I think that is probably a questionable matter in and of itself. Many people will ask, okay, so what was the report about then, in essence? And they've reiterated many a time was to give understanding as to who Viceroy is and what it does. And I suppose in that context, you'd have to understand who the people are behind the company.
And of course, we've been trying to make efforts to get in touch with Viceroy to, to give their side of the story, haven't we? Just let's talk about short selling. I mean, since Viceroy did its thing late last year with the whole Steinhoff story, questions were being raised about is short selling an illegal activity? And my understanding, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, is that it's not. It's a normal activity that takes place in the marketplace, right?
Look, first and foremost, if you were to say short selling is an illegal activity, you might as well go and say share trading. Go on and say that share trading in itself is an illegal activity, because essentially what you're doing is hoping that the price of something goes up under normal circumstances, whereas short selling just means that you hope the price goes down. So, you know, it's different market variations of the exact same thing, and all you're basically saying to people is, I hope that I get a different result to yours, and I will essentially bet in that way.
But I suppose the difficulty comes in where you're perceived to be putting information out there.
That's exactly where
that
Viceroy
you know,
lies.
yeah, that you know will likely bring the share price down.
Exactly. So Viceroy seemingly seems as that company to put out that information that then puts them in a position to say, oh, well, we've dropped out this price and now we look good because we were short sellers on the price of a particular stock. So their attack on Capitec may just mean, however, that they have some sort of influence or some sort of sharing in where the Capitec price is. As
much as you've raised questions about the motivation behind the commissioning of the report and so on, do you think this is going to dent Viceroy's credibility, and when they come out with the next report on the next JSE-listed company, it might not be taken seriously?
Look, fact of the matter is, I think a lot of people have been skeptical of everything in recent times in South Africa. Of course, we're taught now to question every single thing that comes by. We don't take anything for granted anymore. And I think this is another situation like that. If one or two things come out against you, we begin to question everything you put out. It's difficult for Steinhoff to come back as an entity in any particular way, considering the past issues. Questions will be asked of Capitec, whether they're correct questions or not, but questions will be asked because of Viceroy's report. Now, getting this on Viceroy itself will mean that questions will be asked about Viceroy also. Later on, we may ask questions of the BLSA, of Intellidex. I think what happens now is that, let's call it the journalistic integrity, perhaps not just of journalists themselves, but I think of South Africa, will certainly grow and get high. And I think a lot of companies will have to scrutinize themselves and really make sure that they're above board.
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Arabile, for your time. That's my colleague Arabile Gumede just giving us a report on that Intellidex report that came out earlier this morning.